All right, next we're going to talk about transparency maps or opacity maps and how they affect surfaces, because it's going to lead to our creation of those feathers, which I've mentioned several times peppered over these videos. Here's just an example of these kind of transparency maps, which put a hole, it looks like a see-through place, almost that it's cut into the body or the form of the geometry. You could see all the way clearly through it. Certainly one way to use transparency, and transparency is going to work through using values similar to a bump map of black and white as totally transparent or totally opaque, and gray somewhere halfway in between. So if you want to completely see through it, it could be designated as white or pure black, and that relationship flipped or inversed however you wish to change the transparency or opacity. Just demonstrating this with a simple sphere, polygonal sphere in Maya. If it had a checkerboard pattern put on the transparency channel, that is a black and white checkerboard, we'd see a dramatic opacity or transparency difference. I could right click and go into its material. You know, just assign it a Lambert material, something that without a shine to it, it'll be a little bit more evident. Just putting a old Lambert on there, and then going to, let's say it's transparency channel right here, clicking on its channel for pattern, and I'll put on a checkerboard, and then I'll hit 6 so I see the display of that texture, and the illusion is pretty strong. Yeah, to see more density of holes, I could increase the repeat UV higher, put maybe 30 in there, and you could see with very little cost to the geometry, it's the same polygonal count, very low, going to this result. You can imagine how useful it would be for very low poly surfaces to look like they have holes or they're complex or cut out. So something like representing perhaps everyday things, not just an interesting way to create abstraction, but you know, what could you actually use this for in an everyday narrative or storytelling way or character creation way? Perhaps creating something in the background of the props or an environment, in this case a chain link fence, which would require a large amount, imagine extruded parts to create the look of this. Simply with a single polygon you can represent the look of a chain link fence at medium, even somewhat of a close-up distance. And of course, anything else architecturally off of this idea, windows in a building, no need, if the building's in the mid or distance, to ever model the windows or portals or something, parts of mechanical parts of a ship or a building, that you could just use transparency maps to indicate more complexity. Or something like plant material, plant, flora, fauna, stuff like with individual leaves cut out, or with fur or hair. Speaking of fauna, you could do hair on a character or fur on a character that is using cards. In this case, with the leaves, each one of these leaves could be a card of just one polygon, and you could make a whole complex tree from somewhat a mid to distance, and it looked very acceptable. Maybe it's just creating a simple prop that has slats or openings or slits in it, or a open pattern. This thing would be very simple polygonal cylinder with a transparency map to show those openings. And also light could fall through it, a shadow can fall and interplay with light passing to help make a convincing, realistic space around the object that it occupies. It could be used for hair. Here's twisting, very simple polygonal cards being twisted, and this is pre-render, so it could be used for hair, and as soon as the texture goes on there, we'll see more openings between the, let's call that strands of hair, to give a very realistic look. It might not interact as well as other types of XGen or developed hair dynamics, but for games it's extremely efficient and it's commonly used. So after render, it could look like this. Even these stray hair strands can seem to have random separation in them and seem also to react a bit, not individually, but as an illusion of clumps of hair all painted on cards and painted with transparencies. So in the hands of a skilled artist, it can look pretty natural to try to make them intertwined and uneven and organic like this, and have it really work well for long hair. This would rely on your painting skill as well, or your illustrational ability. There are many cards interwoven here, but very simple polygonal cards with a long trail here and painted maybe even 2 or 3 maximum amount of cards used and twisted to look different, and then within each long skinny card it painted with more transparency to let the detail through. Again, the cards pre-render would look something like that. Incredibly simple. In fact, you can eyeball and count each face. 1, 2, 3, 4. Really, really light in polygonal size, vertices and edge. And then with that transparency and color map provided, you could get those other realistic results. So you can see in the side-by-side. Doing something like hair, it would require you to paint these long strands in black and white. You could start with a white, black background and paint in white in the alpha channel of Photoshop. There's different terms for this transparency behavior, let's say, or procedure. It could be opacity mapping, could be called transparency mapping, could be called alpha mapping, because here it's all the same thing. You're drawing in an alpha or transparency in the 4th or alpha channel in Photoshop. And this is getting placed in the alpha, or I take that back, a transparency node in Maya. So all the whites are going to be opaque and all the blacks will be completely transparent. And an orchestration with the color map and the color channel, it will look just like hair. Well, kind of close. It's another pretty good artistic example of using simply transparency cards. I'm using the term cards, and it probably will continue to use the word just transparency cards, C-A-R-D-S. Back to other uses or applications for transparency cards. It's often used to create, again, back to flora, back to grasses, plants, things that have a lot of very fine detail, skinny, complex structures of negative and positive space, just like individual hair strands would be. Same goes with anything else like grasses, and we see examples with the checker box. You can see it has an alpha channel built in here. This would work really nicely for a ready to go grass card. If you'd want to build an environment extremely light and low polygon in Maya, you could have something that looks complex and it would render rather quickly, and it's just using the illusionistic properties of having a flat card here layered in artistically. And of course, that transparency map or card would be a great use or application of creating feathers. And that's where we're at now with my particular character. Perhaps your character has some sort of fur or hair or feather-like, or I don't know, some sort of extending complexity of stuff coming off the body from a costume. It could be pieces of the costume coming off like strings. something that you would think if you modeled it would cause far too many polygonal faces and surfaces. Look for any place or where you can use cards. And yes, this will be separate from the body, not the piece of the same mesh, because usually it's used separately from the body in a case of, you're creating something already, slightly detached from the body, like hair is both attached and detached from the body in a way, feathers to a bird. You can have whole objects that look flat from a distance just be served by transparency cards. So the use is all over the place. Again, depending on how close we're going to see it, it's rather dimensional. And you may be wondering, how do we know it's, why does it look realistic if it's flat? If it's painted on a card, aren't we going to see that it's flat and it's, totally fake? Well, it's really surprising, the illusion of the eye and keeping that plane that it's mapped on perpendicular to the camera. And also there's objects like a feather which exists kind of on a flat plane. So if you tilt it and twist it a little bit, the eye seems to recover and just thinks this is a real feather with real detail in between. It's a very, very strong illusion, and it's at a very cheap cost. And that's why it's used so heavily for gaming and other applications where you just don't need to render everything and model everything. So back to the Larry Birdman design. Rather simply, these cardboard paper looking feathers all in red coming off. I am going to use cards for those. The mask as well, but I'm going to deal with that in the final project because it's part of the head. And I'll use cards for the tail part and the trunk coming off. All right, so let's prepare to do that. Now I'm going to think a step about engineering how I want it to move, because I'm going to create several cards, not just one. If I only created one, this thing would move as a stiff piece, like a single shield or something. I don't want that. I want it to be, look, it's a homemade thing with a homemade hinge, and it's strapped to his arms. Maybe I could create a strap along the way. We'll see. So when he moves his arms, it's as if it's homemade, and some parts move with sections of the arm and some parts move with others. And then there's this little tuft of extra cardboard on the back of the hand. So I'm going to create maybe, let's see, just guesstimating, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 cards just for this one, which I will recycle and use. I won't have to create the cards twice and use for these on this side. Then these sticking out here, I might do unique ones because it could stick straight down. And then maybe more individualistic ones, a clusters of 2 or 3. See how it goes for the tail part. Hey, jumping around. Okay, for this part. Okay, let's just get started at the first section of the arm feathers. I'm calling them feathers, they're paper cards. Okay, fortunately I had this saved in Photoshop on layers, so I turned off the blue body and the jersey, and I could probably also turn off the head so it can get at some of this material better. So I'm going to select and pluck from all this resource, and perhaps I'll make another file and I'll assemble these cards within another image on Photoshop. Okay, I just put the jersey on, giving an indication of where it is. I know things moved, but I don't really need any of this stuff inside because I'm going to keep his jersey on all the time because it's part of the mesh. So I will just start to select just areas that I think I'll want to represent the first card. So I'll select maybe in here. Let's just give a little bit extra like that. I'll go like that. Let's do under here. This makes sense. This will be where I'm tracing in for the first card. A chunk like that would be probably good. And like that. Okay, so I'll copy that. Let's just do a demo of one card and then I'll do all the rest. You can understand how to do it on your own or whatever your character design is, the concept will translate fine. So I'm just going to do this chunk, and I know my material lies on this layer saying torso front, so I'm going to cut that and paste it into a new file I had made in Photoshop. Okay, there it is. I just have to make sure I have enough pixels. This is about 900 high by 600 wide, depending how close I'm. I did the character 3 up on a page when it's designed, so it's losing a little bit of resolution. So maybe I want to up-res this just a bit. So, and we can draw in and do a better artistic job and repair areas here if we like. Easier yet, what I'll do straight away is just try to solve some of this in the alpha channel, and that part is coming up. But maybe just to repair some weird parts here that may or may not show first. Also, lighten up some shadows that are falling here, because shadows will be created anyway with the Arnold renderer. It's nice to have some illusionistic implied shadows there as well, but maybe not super dark. So I'm trying to quiet down a little bit some of the darkest shadows. Okay. Next, I'll crop that a little better, because this is only one piece of the card and I don't need all this white space, so I'm going to crop it. Okay, and I can come pretty close to here. I really don't need that much white space around it, but at the same time it's not excessive. But if I like, I could come a little bit closer. Something like that. Just make sure you don't clip the edge of the card. This will definitely be noticeable if you had some kind of mistake where you clipped it off here. You're going to see that edge falling off the card. So just make sure you've got all of it and closed in pretty tight to the crop. Okay, next you're going to go into the alpha. You're going to create an alpha to remove all of everything that's not red, let's say, the white part, and that will be transparent. Okay, I don't need this background. I can throw it away. It is really slowing down, only when I recorded for you guys, so I don't know what else to do, so I'll just pause it. So I threw away any white background I don't need, so showing the checkerboard pattern. Now I could use just this as a TIFF that contains an alpha. If I brought it into Maya, it would see that checkerboard has no pixels, so it would guess that that's the alpha for it, and it would be clear. Well, you've heard me say alpha. What do I mean by alpha? What's an alpha? That has not maybe been explained, but there's 4 channels to some types of images, like TIFF, TGA, some PNG, and there's 3 channels to other types, like JPEG. JPEG cannot contain a 4th channel. Anyway, for those that contain a 4th channel, those are larger file formats, and they have that channel which is RGBA. The other ones are just RGB for the color. Well, something like TIFF holds a 4th channel, A channel, and A stands for alpha, and it's designated just to determine transparency or opacity. So yes, we could use this straight away, but it doesn't have the kind of edges that I want. I'm going to actually paint a custom alpha channel for this, and for that I need to create one in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do first is go to this image, and I want to draw a little more crisply around the edges with the lasso tool, or you can use whatever tool you like. If you're drawing with a pen, of course, it's going to be more artistic. I'm trying to represent more a jagged paper-like edge than that softer edge that's already pixelized there. You can see how I'm just installing a little bit of imperfection or shakiness into that to give like a scissor cut edge feel look to it. All right, something like that. Okay. Now with that selection, all I really need to do, okay, but for this technique, I don't really care about the checkerboard missing pixels here because I'm going to create my own custom alpha channel, fourth channel here. So I could leave this at it as it is, or I could flatten it just to simplify the file size. It doesn't matter anyway because I'm going to take this out, I'm going to flatten the image so it's white, and I'm going to create a separate image for an alpha channel. So I selected all this just previously. Then I go, instead of layers in Photoshop, to channels. And a channel, I have this selection. With that selection still active, I'm clicking this button on the bottom that says Save Selection as Channel. Click it. All right, and what it created is an alpha. And the alpha, let's just highlight it, has a black and white appearance. So everything white is going to be opaque 100%, everything black, clear. Now, the reason I did this with an alpha channel instead of just having a checkerboard pixel-less image and bring that into the mesh is because I can customize how it fades in. Let's say if I want soft edges, I could go and change maybe burning in some of the highlights. If I wanted, if this were real feathers or something, I could go and fade with adding black in here or just knocking down a little bit, see what's happening, that edge, and that would add semi-transparency. So any of the gray would be semi-transparent, right? So if it were like hair and the ends of hair, or if it was a real feather and the sides of the real feather, it would look good to have semi-transparency on there. Or another way to say that, if any part is gray, 50%, that's going to be 50% clear or opaque, whichever you like to think. But I'm going to undo because this is a cutout paper or cardboard. So I'm going to leave it just as is. Looking back at all my layers, so the RGB and the fourth channel is alpha, it will show this pink part. The pink is what it's masking out. I guess you have to ignore it's already pinkish and red, but everything this color pink is what's called the mask or the alpha, and that's what's going to be clear, another indication. All right, so you'll want to save this as a file that has the option of that fourth channel. I'm going to save it as a TIFF. So I'll save it as feather piece 1 and format as a TIFF. And you'll see here alpha channels is awake and checked. So I know it's reading it, and save that. Now back to Maya, and I just have only this card in the scene. When I mean card, it's just a polygon plane with 4 polygons to it. Just created a polygon plane, and I'm going to go and put a material. I put a Lambert on it, just simple Lambert material so it's not shiny, and I'll go and grab that file. And here's surface material. I'm going to put it on the color channel. Now you'd think I would need it on transparency channel right there. But because I created a fourth channel, I'm hoping it auto detects it. Let's see. Otherwise, I would need to put a separate transparency on there. But if the color can read that fourth channel, then it will assume that transparency channel alpha as well. Let me show you what I mean. Let's try it. Just putting on the color channel and choosing the file, then opening the file. and it's feather piece 1, and open, and make sure you hit 6 on the keyboard, and there you have it. There is the piece I have wireframe on shading, so I'll take that off. I believe I have that. Smooth shade. Oh, we're cool. All right, so that's what it looks like. All right, might take some orienting. You might have to play with the UVs a little bit to make sure it's flatly projecting. You might have to go to the UV texture editor and make sure that's falling squarely in the middle. Play with UVs, probably because you created just a simple polygon shape for this test here. The UVs are going to follow likely right down the center of the shape. If not, if you created a more twisted plane or something, you'll have to mess with the UVs to make it fit, but it's going to fall in line pretty well. And I suggest start assembling this here and then adjust it if you want to make this twisted or a little bit shaped as a polygon, that you do it after you take care of any projecting in the UVs. Again, minimally. I don't think you'll need to do much changing of the UVs or projecting, but this is what you do piece by piece. And I think I have 6 or 7 pieces to each wing, and I have that little bit tucked under his tummy and stuff on the tail. So I'll work on that a bit. But if I want to do just a test and I want to pop this into the finished character body I have so far, I could select it and export just like I did the hand. It's a piece of geometry with a transparency card on it. So I'm just going to select the hand, export it, and import it into the character body scene and see what it looks like there. So I saved as an export selection, saved that card just as a test as that export, and I'm going to import it, bring it into this finished body, put it in a folder called red cards and red card 1, and it should come through with this texture. So continue. So exporting, because I don't want all the lights or any of that stuff from the scene, just the card. Okay, there it is. I'm gonna position it and start putting that where it belongs in the scene and the relation to the character. And yep, so to get its purpose now and where we're going, just need to continue to create these and start to arrange and stack them up here. Probably going back to look at the reference. But that's the direction we're going to be going. Now I made another piece. I just duplicated that plane and made another piece here. I could start to collect these, orchestrate them and layer them to give them illusion of depth, thickness. But I painted another piece different from this, so I'm going to make sure you do this. You got to create a new material, so it doesn't, you need you got to start from scratch, brand new material, then material attributes. Otherwise it's going to imitate the other image, and you don't want to do that. So I'm going to grab another piece that I made here called feather piece 2, and now it's start to really come together. How I'm going to tuck them into one another like that. I'll work on that a while. Notice when I go and right click material attributes, it found the transparency. It found it in there. I didn't need to actually load it because I had a 4th channel. Maya already detected that alpha and it plopped it right in the transparency channel for us. So we didn't really need to do that. So as I'm building, I'm getting this kind of look, but I think when I look at it from the side, it's looking very, very thin. What I believe would be even better is if I use this as kind of a cardboard foundation and then do 2 or 3 cards of each leaf put together, and just start, connecting single or double polygon leaves with the transparency on it, and build up a look, kind of like this, where all these leaves look pretty similar. It's really the same leaf turned a little direction. These are transparency cards that have transparency on them and specular on them, and they look quite natural, just with some finesse. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend some more time on here, cut back to get a diversity of looking individual leaves. So I have that so far, and I'm going to spruce it up with individual leaves, or say individual feathers. So I'll create 2 or 3 prototype feathers and just start sticking them in there and integrating them to give them the thicker illusion of leafiness, featheriness, like that. So I'll work on it. So here I made 3 separate little cards for individual feathers, which I'll spend time to take this as a background and kind of festoon, insert sticking here or there these individual cards, mixing them up to give them a fluffiness and a reality of mixing, and again, this kind of a integration of each card, a little twist and turn here or there to make it look different, as if it's trying to fill out a mass of cardboard feathers. I mean, it's not going to be too heavy. It just can't be as flat looking as what I have with those singular cards. It may actually help to see the cards just as a shade. Turn on the 5 or the 4, 5, so you see only the gray shaded version of it. And I move the pivot to the end so I could just point it in here, there. It's going to take a bit to put this together, and I'll cut back. If you haven't used this, what can make things snap one object or one thing to another faster is if you hold V down for snap to point. Here's all your snaps right there: snap to grid, snap to curve, there's snap to point. If I hold snap to point, it's going to put these cards snap to the, let's say, the face of the other cards that I already have as a foundation. That's quite convenient if I start to proliferate these cards all over the place, and maybe have another one peeling off here and snap it to another part. Or maybe I want to flip it around to make the feather seem like a different feather, change the scale, that sort of thing. So I have to mind where the normals are. If I want to see that nice in the graphic view, I just flip the normals. Display, mesh display reverse if it ever turns dark. These cards are very, very light in geometry, so there's no punishment for adding a lot of them. So I want to flip it over and mesh display reverse. So I can really nest them in there and get quite heavy with almost no impact on the polygon or file, or the polygon count and the file size in general. So as working on it, you can see a little bit of featheriness, dimensionality, and I'll add some individual feathers to the back of the hand. These cards are sort of in lieu of paint effects, which will be too heavy to add. This will be super light. You can place them one card by one exactly where we want. I'm going to show another tip or trick with, I want to put this fringe of feathers on the belly of the character, and I want the polygon to wrap around it. I have a trick where I can draw a polygon just on the surface of it. If I select this surface and go to Modify, Make Live, Modify, Make Live, that makes this surface it's considered live, which is green. When you see that in the wireframe, that means it's going to attract anything I draw on top of it. So if I create polygon tool and I draw on top of it, say create polygon tool, it's going to stick to the surface as I draw. So if I click, here we go, you can see what's happening as I click. It's drawing this polygon that's sticking to the surface. And this Y to complete. And so this is the polygon that's wrapping around the surface because I said make live. And you can just see what's going on. It's wrapping around nicely. I just have to make some connections so they're all quads before I go any further. So I look at it and looking at the 4 view, hitting the 4, I just have to match these up. I'll use the Multicut tool for that if you have not used it. It's good for doing precise, kind of X-Acto knife, surgery kind of stuff. So I'll go to the Edit Mesh and I'm going to use the Mesh tools. And I'm going to go to Multicut, and I'm just going to click one CV, and then click the other CV. It does this orange potential line, and then hit Y to commit. I'm going to do that again. Click the other one and connect, and Y. So I know that this is all pure quads. Wherever I have CV, I'm going to connect one CV to the other, Y, one CV to the other. Hit Y on the keyboard, and of course I could use this insert edge ring tool if I want to break something up like that into 2 quads from 1. It's allowing me to slide that on the surface too. A lot of technique that can be built upon experience as you model. Okay, now that that's curving along this polygon, I'm going to use that as a bending card to put a fringe of feathers down there. And I don't need it live anymore, so I can select this mesh and make not live. So you just select it again, modify, and then make not live. So it goes back to normal. And then, of course, this is a separate polygon which you could pull out. You might have to sometimes center the pivot as you model. Modify center pivot. If you don't see, as you model, the pivot where it should be, which is right at the center of the object, sometimes you hit modify center pivot. Anyway, we can see this, how nicely it's hugging that shape. To create that polygon and move each one would have taken a long time, would have been a hassle. So this is really convenient using Make Live and drawing singular polygons on the surface like that to make this fringe. And I'm going to have this fringe card a little bit larger and pop out like that. Okay, now I'm going to put that transparency texture on it. I already made it. Now make sure I put a new Lambert on there, or it's going to imitate the other shaders. Make sure every new object you need a new shader, a new material. So I have a new material, and I'll put in my fringe transparency that I made, fringe feathers. Okay, let's hit 6 so we see all the textures. Okay, it's going to need a little better placement. See, it's doing the wrapping around as I need, but I will have to open the UV editor and place that better, because it looks like this. Not quite right. It's just so easy to grab these simple UVs in the editor and drag them and make them fit around the image. It's so quick. I don't have to mess with any reprojections of the UV, new texture placement strategies. Just go in straight to the UVs, and there's not many of them, and realign them so it takes up what I need. Okay, so that's what I was aiming for. Just evening the shell out a little better, the UV shell, and it's wrapping around quite nicely as I intended. Then maybe I can stick in a few singular feathers here or there poking out underneath the jersey. Okay, I'm going to work on this a lot more, fuss with it, play with it, push and pull it around. But I'm going to end the video here because you get the general drift of transparency cards, or we can just say cards, and how they're used with a very light and interactive model. And if you have hair, if you have some kind of flowing material that looks like feathers or hair or fur or something like that, you might employ the same thing if you want this character to interact with the skeleton later. Or if not, you can go with the paint effects and go really heavy with it. It's just I needed to show the option, because if you're going in the direction of making a capstone or something with a character that actually has to move and animate and work, you better think of a low poly strategy. And that's what cards do, because if we look at it, we have really a collection of cards that are singular or double polygons only, and just a recycled texture over and over. So very, very light. All right, so I'm going to pick up more detail in the next video, and we're almost finished really with the visual construction of this, and we're ready nearly for render. I'm going to finish doing these and copy all the red stuff over to the other side. I'm going to do the tail, and there's an important step about using a material. If we're going to render with Arnold, we need a special transparent material, because normally Arnold does not want to render transparency cards, but we just have to do a little extra step to make sure it can do it. It's not a big deal. Okay, let's stop there.